This is Bruce Wall from the City of Scottsdale's Neighborhood College Program. We're all in this together.
The City of Peoria. We're in this together.
The City of Chandler. We're in this together.
Hi, this is Jamie from the City of Scottsdale with my daughter Jocelyn. We're in this together.
City of Tempe. We are in this together.
Welcome everybody, class number 10 of our 2021 virtual HOA and Condo Academy. We're here today in partnership with the cities of Avondale, Chandler, Glendale, Goodyear, Mesa, Peoria, Phoenix, Scottsdale, Surprise, and Tempe. My name is Beth Mulcahy, and I'm your presenter today, and I'm the managing partner and senior attorney for the Mulcahy Law Firm in Phoenix, Arizona. I've been working with associations, HOAs, and condominiums for nearly 25 years. My firm currently represents over 1,000 planned communities and condominium associations throughout the state of Arizona. And I also serve on my HOA board and have served on it for many years. At this point, since March 2020, our firm has hosted 42 virtual seminars since the coronavirus pandemic started. Since March 2020, our virtual classes have combined 47,000 views, which is awesome. So we're so happy that you have been a part of making these virtual classes successful. And we really appreciate you being here and caring about your community, whether you're a board member, a homeowner, or a manager who works in our industry. So we're going to be sharing some links with you that we think might contain some useful information. First, we're going to have our website, which for those of you who have been there, it's at mulcahylawfirm.com. It contains a wealth of free information for really anyone in our industry, whether you're a board member, a manager, or a homeowner. We also have a LinkedIn page, which also contains our blog articles and other great information that's free to those who are interested in learning more about what's going on in HOA and condo law. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. This is a great turnout for our October Neighborhood Services Virtual HOA Academy. We're going to be discussing board meetings and annual meetings today, and really every topic associated with those two topics. So we have a lot to cover in an hour. First things first, I always like to know a little bit about who's in my audience, especially when I'm teaching a virtual class. So you can see that we've already put our poll questions up. There's two questions. So the first question is, which city do you reside in? And then the second question is, we'd like to know who's joining us here today. So let us know what your current role is. Are you a board member, a community manager, interested homeowner, or other person in our industry? So if you can answer those two poll questions, then that really helps me, tailor the class to who's here today and make sure that I cover everything that's an important topic for you today. Okay, so it looks like we have many different cities represented here today. It looks like we have Avondale and Goodyear, a large number of people from Chandler, 13%. 11% from Mesa, 3% from Peoria, 17% from Phoenix, 21% from Scottsdale, 2% from Surprise, and about 30% from some other cities within the state of Arizona. And then if we go to what is your current role, we have 70% of you joining us here today are board members, 13% are community managers, 15% are homeowners, and 3% are other. So great. We have a really wide variety of people here today. A majority of you, though, are board members. Okay. So thank you very much for participating in the polls. It really does help us create a better class experience for you and be able to tailor our presentation best for who's in our audience. Okay, so let's start out by talking a little bit about board meetings. So we're going to be sharing a cheat sheet with you via Zoom and also on Facebook Live. It's probably our most popular cheat sheet, and it's called Community Association Board Meetings. And this cheat sheet is a great deep dive if you're interested in learning more about this. This is a great deep dive for determining how to set up your board meetings, what type of notice you need, how to comply with the Arizona Open Meeting Law, how to take perfectly proper meeting minutes. So all of that information is on that cheat sheet. So I'd encourage you to look at it. If you're joining us after this presentation has been recorded, you can find this cheat sheet on our website at mulcahylawfirm.com. and just click on our cheat sheets tab and type in board meetings, and that cheat sheet will pop right up. Okay, so the first topic we're going to talk about is board meetings. So this is something that most boards are dealing with or handling on a monthly basis. And so I think we're probably going to spend a majority of our time today, or probably 60% of our time today, talking about, how to run a board meeting, how to plan it, what are some different problems that can come up during the board meeting. So first, let's talk a little bit about, and we're going to show you also how to have a short board meeting where you accomplish things and you aren't distracted with a whole bunch of other things that are going on, and not accomplishing association business. So the first thing that I want to talk about is if you want to have a successful regular board meeting, what you need to do is you really do need to plan for it. The planning part of having a board meeting takes some time, but it's going to lead to a better informed board and board members that come into the meeting more prepared, and then just a smoother meeting where you actually accomplish things. So we're going to give you some suggestions on how to, plan a meeting so that you have a really efficient meeting. So the first thing you need to do is think about your agenda. So, about 10 days before your regular board meeting, the board president and typically the manager will start working on the agenda for the board meeting. And a properly planned agenda is going to provide organization and is going to shorten the lengths of meetings. The agenda is the backbone of the board packet, and it needs to include enough detail to help board members prepare for the meeting. And so some suggestions on what I suggest that you have on your agenda for your board meeting would be, first, always have the name of your association, what type of board meeting it is. So let's say you're planning it for the October board meeting. So it'll be the October 2021 regular board meeting. You'll want to have the date, the start time, the location for the meeting. On the agenda, the first thing that you'll have typically is approval. Well, first you open the meeting, establish a quorum, and then you're going to approve last month's meeting minutes, or whenever your last board meeting was, those meeting minutes. Then typically you go into officer reports, then committee reports, and then usually we end up with the manager's report. And sometimes we may have new business, old business also on the agenda. So what I really recommend is that the agenda be very specific. And by that, I mean, you can have the officer reports. You probably want to have the president and the treasurer give a report if your association does that. Your committee reports, if there's any like architectural committee issues or any like budget committee this time of the year, a lot of the budget committees are meeting. And then the manager report usually is the longest part of the class or of the meeting. And so some recommendations that I have on the agenda. Number one, you want to state with particularity what you're going to be discussing so that, owners will be able to attend if they are interested in a topic. And a lot of associations, after the law changed a couple of years ago, they started using the agenda as the notice of meeting because we need to notify owners of what the topics are going to be discussed during regular board meetings. And so basically what a lot of boards did was they just transitioned right into using the agenda as the official notice of the regular board meeting. Some suggestions that I have on the agenda to make your meetings run a little smoother would be that you should put benchmark times on the agenda. So for example, you could put the start time of the meeting. Let's say your meeting starts at 6 p.m. You establish a quorum, let's say between 6 and 6:05 p.m. You approve last month's meeting minutes between 6:05 and 6:10 p.m. You go into officer reports, maybe from 6:10 to 6:25 p.m. Then committee reports, 6:25 to 6:30 p.m. And then the manager's report, let's say from 6:30 to 7 p.m. And then as the president of your association, you really should be trying to stick to those timelines to keep people on track and be really efficient with how the meeting is running. So putting those benchmark timeframes on the agenda is really a good kind of tip so that you set yourself up to have an hour board meeting. Now, obviously, if you have a topic that's going to be like a deep dive, like this time of the year, usually the budget, I'd probably allocate between 15 and 20 minutes for a discussion of the budget. So that particular meeting where you're discussing the budget may be a longer than normal board meeting. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the agenda. We're going to be talking about the notice of meeting in a few minutes, but like I said, a lot of associations are using the agenda to provide the 48 hours notice to the membership of the regular board meeting. So I would encourage you, to include that information on the agenda, and then also make sure that you're posting it on the common areas of the association, or maybe putting it on your website to provide that 48 hours notice to your membership. Okay, another thing that is a really helpful tip for having regular board meetings is having a board packet for your board members. And typically how this works is that the community manager or a designated board member prepares and distributes the board packet several days in advance of the board meeting. If you're A+ manager or you're really organized as a board, if the board's doing this, having that board packet to your board at least 1 or 2 days in advance of the board meeting is really helpful. I've served on my board for over 14 years and, at varying times. And what I can tell you is that I'm a much better board member when I receive the packet at least a day before the meeting, and I just skim it and just do a quick run through as to what are going to be the topics of the meeting. So I walk into the meeting informed. And so if you're not doing this, here's some suggestions on how you can, set up your board packet for your board meeting. So the board packet is going to contain the agenda, a copy of the agenda with the benchmark times that I just talked about, minutes from the previous board meeting that will indicate, a full copy of the draft meeting minutes that the board's going to be approving that evening at your board meeting or during the day, during your board meeting, whenever it is. It's going to contain the financial information for your association, which is going to be discussed when the treasurer gives a financial overview of how things are going this month at your association and a review of last month's financials. Committee information, the management and the treasurer's reports, any important correspondence that your association may have, any bids that your board might be voting on at that board meeting, so that you can take a look at those bids before the board meeting. The board packet, this is a really important tip. It should be arranged in the same chronological order as the meeting agenda. And try to use colored paper or tabs to differentiate each section in your board packet, so it's really easy for board members to find which section that you're currently discussing during the board meeting. And then label all these items and place them in the agenda section as to when they'll be addressed. Okay, so we briefly talked a little bit about the notice of board meetings. So what type of notice do we have to give of regular board meetings? So under Arizona law, regardless of what your documents state, the association has to give notice of a regular board meeting at least 48 hours in advance of the meeting by newsletter, conspicuous posting, or any other reasonable means. Then the board really can make the determination as to how to give that 48 hours notice. So bottom line is, if your association's having a regular board meeting, you have to give 48 hours notice of that board meeting to your members. And most of our clients, I can comment on, they're placing notice of the regular board meeting on the association's website. They may be posting it on bulletin boards in the association. Some of them are putting it out in a newsletter. Some of them send out a reminder email. All of these ways of notifying your residents of the board meetings are sufficient under the law. The key thing to remember on your notice of meeting is that the date, time, and location of the meeting must be stated. And the notice of any board meeting must also state the purpose for which the meeting is called. So as I said earlier in this presentation, our firm suggests providing a detailed agenda with the notice of meeting, or you can maybe make the agenda your actual notice of meeting to meet this requirement. Now, a couple little practice pointers that we can talk about that I think are important for you to know would be, if you're having an emergency meeting, the 48 hours notice, is suspended. And so we're going to talk about emergency meetings in a minute here, but that's just kind of something important for you to know. A question that I get often on the notice of meetings, of regular board meetings, is do we have to notice an executive session? If we're just meeting to discuss executive session topics, do we have to notice an executive session? Absolutely, yes, you do. And we're going to talk about executive sessions here in a minute, but that's going to be where it's just the board discussing executive session topics. And there's a special notice requirement for those executive session meeting minutes, or for the executive session notice that we're going to talk about in a minute. A few other points on the board meetings. So a couple suggestions here would be, remember that you should be conducting your board meetings in a business environment. I mean, I'm kind of laughing saying this, but many years ago, I went to a board meeting, a regular board meeting of a board, and they were actually having it at a restaurant bar. And when I went back to look at the meeting, to find the meeting, everybody, was basically like sitting around the bar, and they had pitchers of beer, which really looked like a great time, but it wasn't the best business environment. And also some of the questions, there might be some questions regarding, the decision-making by the board if they were impaired. So remember, this is just a short meeting. Let's make it professional, have it in a business environment. That could be at a library, it could be in your clubhouse, it could be at your pool area, could be in a board member's home. But the key thing is having it in a business environment, because really we're running a business here. It's a nonprofit corporation, and we need to treat it like that. Some other thoughts are, under Arizona law, all meetings of the association and the board must be held in Arizona. Now, this has kind of been an interesting dynamic, right, with the pandemic and a lot of us having a virtual meetings due to the governor's stay-at-home orders back in March and April 2020. But the way that the law currently reads is that the meeting of the association and the board must be held within Arizona. However, remember, though, that the law does allow for directors to appear telephonically or virtually. And so, this is something that I truly do think is going to be changed at some point, maybe even in the 2022 legislative session for the Arizona legislature. Remember, another thing on the location that you're going to suggest for your board meetings is have a neutral location. Conduct meetings in an environment that, enhances productivity, and also is not going to cause discord. So you wouldn't want to have it at a board member's home if there is going to be a lot of fighting or yelling. I hope that's not the case. Or let's say that, a board member has a restraining order against an owner, and that board member decides to have it at their home so that that homeowner can't attend. You don't ever want to do something like that. Just have it in a neutral business-like location. And then don't forget, when you come to the meeting as board members, make sure you're bringing your board packet and your association documents. Okay, let's switch gears and talk a little bit about the open meeting law. So just as a little refresher, what are some of the things that we've talked about? We talked about using the agenda, making sure it's detailed, having the time benchmarks on it. Using a board packet that's organized in the same manner that the meeting's going to be run, giving notice to your owners of the board meeting. Under Arizona law, it's required 48 hours in advance of the meeting. And you have to have a notice for a regular board meeting and also for an executive session board meeting. Both of those are required to give, the notice to the members. Remember that notice is typically done by conspicuous posting on the property, putting it on the website of the association, sending out an email, putting it in your newsletter. All of these are valid ways to notify your residents 48 hours in advance of the meeting. And then last but not least, have it in a business-like and neutral location, have that board meeting. Okay, let's talk about the open meeting law in Arizona. Arizona has a special open meeting law for HOAs and condos, and it's different than the open meeting law that applies to, let's say, school boards or city council. And so let's talk just briefly about what our special open meeting law in Arizona says. So under Arizona, and I'll give you the statute sections. If you're a planned community, it's A.R.S. sections 33-1801. And if you're a condominium, it's 33-1248. And you could just Google those citations I just gave you, if you want to look at the exact language of the law, you just Google A.R.S. for Arizona Revised Statutes, and then the numbers 33-1801 for planned communities and 33-1248 for condominiums. Okay, so what does this open meeting law, this special open meeting law say? So it says, anytime there's a meeting of the board of directors or a regularly scheduled committee meeting, these meetings are required to be open to all association members or their designated representatives. So anytime a quorum of the board is meeting to discuss association business, it needs to be noticed as an open board meeting. Anytime you have a committee that meets regularly, those regularly scheduled committee meetings need to be, noticed 48 hours in advance of the meeting. So at the meeting, the members or their designated representatives. So how do you become a designated representative? If the member can appoint you in writing to be their designated representative. So the members or their designated representatives can attend the meetings, listen, and participate at appropriate times. So when is an appropriate time for a member to communicate with the board? So what the requirement is that anytime the board's taking formal action on something, the members are allowed to contribute. And so typically what will happen is that the board member will make a motion, there'll be a second, and then there'll be discussion. If a member wishes to contribute something before the board votes or takes formal action on this, the member will need to raise their hand and ask to be heard. A lot of boards, although they're not required to, a lot of boards also have what we call a homeowner forum, either at the beginning of the meeting or at the end of the meeting, where homeowners are allowed to, talk about anything, ask the board questions, make a comment about how things are going at the association. And so a lot of boards have that homeowner forum period as well as an opportunity for homeowners to, provide feedback to the board. Let's switch gears and talk a little bit about executive sessions. Executive sessions are going to be the time where just the board is meeting to discuss executive session topics. And as I said earlier, executive sessions still do need to be noticed 48 hours in advance of the meeting, even if the homeowners can't be there, if it's just the board that meets during executive session. So what are the topics that a board can go into executive session for? I can give you, there's basically 5 topics that the board can go into executive session for, and I'm going to just give those to you briefly, and then I'm going to give you just the skinny on what are the real topics that, from a practical standpoint, that the board goes into executive session to discuss. Maybe I should do that first, because I think that's probably the easiest thing to remember. Okay, so most boards go into executive session when they're discussing advice from their attorney. That's an easy answer. So if the attorney gives an opinion on something, and it could be by email or a verbal opinion to a board member or manager, the board can discuss that during executive session. The board can talk about anytime you're thinking about suing an owner or anytime the association's actually being sued. So where do we see that practically? It could be, we're talking about delinquencies and violations are typically the times that we talk about that. Although I have seen a really large increase in the number of lawsuits that are being filed for trip and falls in associations, and also on architectural decisions gone bad for an association. So really it's a pretty broad umbrella for the second category that you can go into executive session. The third and fourth topics, we just don't go into executive session that often to talk about, but they're notable, so I want to mention them. So the third topic you can go into executive session to discuss would be personal health and financial information about an individual member of the association, an individual employee of a contractor for the association, or an individual employee of the association. So personal health, financial information about your owners, independent contractors, or employees of the association. The fourth topic you can go into executive sessions for is you're going to be discussing the job performance of, compensation of, health records of, or specific complaints against an individual employee of the association or an independent contractor of the association. And then last but not least, the fifth topic is going to be discussion of the unit owner's appeal of any violation cited or any penalty imposed by the association. However, if the owner wants to go into the open session to discuss this, the owner has the right to move that to the open session. Okay, so let's go through just a real quick, run through on that. So when can the board go into executive session? They have to notice the executive session meeting 48 hours in advance of the meeting. Some boards, when they send out their regular meeting notice agenda, they'll place at the bottom of the agenda after the regular meeting, concludes, we'll go automatically into executive session. And when the board does that, they're going to want to make sure that they place on the agenda to identify the section under the law that authorized the board to close the meeting. And so, for example, you could say we're going to go into executive session after the regularly scheduled board meeting, and we're going to discuss delinquencies, violations, and advice from our attorney. And that's an important thing to remember. You are required under the law to state with particularity which section under the law that you're going into executive session to discuss. Okay, so quick recap of executive sessions. The most common reasons that boards go into executive sessions, and remember, it's just the board, not the homeowners, unless the board invites a special guest, like the manager or the attorney, or maybe an owner that they're going to be discussing a violation or appeal on. The most common topics that boards go into discuss during executive session are advice from their attorney, delinquencies, violations, maybe threatened lawsuits against the association like trip and fall, or maybe even an actual lawsuit against the association. We also see boards discussing performance of employees and vendors during executive session, and also their compensation. And so those are the most common topics that we see boards going into executive session for. Some no-nos on executive session. Important that I talk to you about the mistakes that I often see boards making when they go into executive session. So sometimes a board will go into executive session to discuss an executive session topic, but then they veer off and start talking about something else. Like I was on a board meeting last week via Zoom, and the board was veering off and they were talking about how they were unhappy with the performance of a vendor. And then the next thing I knew, the board was veering off and voting to fire the vendor. And that is something that should be done in the open session. So when you're dealing with vendors as a board, you can talk about their performance, you can talk about their compensation during the closed session. But if you're going to hire or fire a vendor, that needs to be done during the open session. And really, that's it on executive sessions. It's not that complicated as long as you stick to the parameters of the topics that you can discuss during executive session. And we're going to be talking about meeting minutes in a few minutes, but remember that executive session meeting minutes need to be taken for every executive session board meeting, as well as for any regular board meeting. And you'll want to make those a separate document so that they can be withheld from discovery if an owner wants to see them. And that just makes sense, because if they can't be at the meeting for the executive session meeting, they shouldn't be entitled to see the minutes of the executive session meeting. Okay, let's just talk about a couple other little aspects of the open meeting law that I think are important that you know about. The agenda has to be available to all owners attending the meeting. So obviously we talked about using the agenda as the notice of the meeting. That's one way to do it. Also, if you're having a virtual board meeting right now, you can share on your screen of the virtual board meeting on Zoom a copy of the agenda. If you're having your meetings in person, you can have an extra copies of the agenda there for owners who come, have it at the entrance of the meeting, and they can just grab a copy of the agenda so they can follow along. Let's talk a little bit about emergency board meetings. So there is a special exception under the law for emergencies. So if the board has a true emergency, and how is an emergency defined? An emergency is defined as the board cannot wait 48 hours to notify the membership through a notice of meeting. And so from time to time, there will be emergencies that come up on your board. And when that happens, you can have a regular board meeting. You can suspend the notice requirement that you would normally be required for having a regular open board meeting, and have an emergency board meeting. And at that meeting, you have to take minutes, and then you have to read into the record at the next regularly scheduled board meeting why you had an emergency meeting and what exactly transpired at that emergency board meeting. Let's see. Informal board meetings. I get this question a lot, so I want to talk about it. So a lot of associations will say, hey, we just want to have a board meeting, a quorum of the board meet, and just, chit chat about association issues. We're not going to be making any formal decisions. So can we call it like a work study or an informal board meeting? And if we do that, do we still have to notice the board meeting? And my answer to you on that is yes, you do. The law is very clear in Arizona that anytime a quorum of the board is meeting to discuss association business, it needs to be an open board meeting. So be mindful of that, whether you're making decisions or not making decisions. If you have a quorum of the board meeting to discuss association business, it needs to be noticed as a board meeting. A couple other little things to note. Homeowners are allowed to tape and or video record open board meetings, but the board can pass reasonable rules and regulations as to how that is, accomplished by a homeowner. Now, what I can tell you is that probably 75% of our boards are still meeting virtually right now, and probably many of them are going to continue to meet virtually even after this pandemic is over. And so, a feature of using Zoom or whatever online platform that you're using is that the meetings are being taped automatically. And so if you have a homeowner who, wants to tape it or whatever, I think you can just tell them, hey, you can make a request for the recording after the meeting. That would comply with the law. Okay, one more thing on executive sessions that I'd like to mention is that if you go into executive session, be mindful when you're having it. The wrong way to do it is how I'm going to tell you right now. So the board has a regular board meeting, and then about 20 minutes into the regular board meeting, they decide they're going to go into executive session for 10 minutes and then come back and have the regular board meeting again after the executive session. And when this happens, I always cringe but what happens is you have to ask everybody who's there attending the meeting, the regular board meeting, to get up and leave and go wait outside or in the hallway or whatever. And people tend to get pretty agitated when they're asked to do that. So really what our recommendation is, plan to go into executive session either before your board meeting starts or after the meeting so that the members do not have to wait. And then remember, under the law, anytime you go into executive session, the agenda, meeting notice is going to have to state the reasons why you're going into executive session under the law. I'm going to see something quickly on parliamentary procedure because I got an email earlier today. It was forwarded to me from a board member in Arizona who is a parliamentarian, and he had some comments about whether, Robert's Rules of Order is how we should utilize Robert's Rules of Order for associations. So I just want to make a brief comment on that. Remember that associations are not required to follow Robert's Rules of Order unless your association documents, typically it would be in your bylaws, state that you must follow Robert's Rules of Order. So oftentimes we'll hear maybe from owners who are residents saying, hey, you're not following parliamentary procedure under Robert's Rules of Order, the revised edition. And I think our answer back is that, okay, our documents don't require us to specifically follow Robert's Rules of Order. But there are some aspects of Robert's Rules of Order that are helpful, like staying on one topic at a time, sticking to the agenda, giving every board member an opportunity to speak if they want to. So you don't want to get too hung up on, that you're not following to a T Robert's Rules of Order if your association doesn't require you to follow it. A couple things, some suggestions, just some reminders to make sure that your meetings run efficiently. And this is kind of our, how to have a 1-hour board meeting. Use that timed agenda that we talked about earlier in this presentation. That's super helpful to time the amount of time you're going to be spending on a subject. And if you go over that, you may want to table continued discussion until next month's meeting. Remember, board members should be on time and prepared to discuss association business so that we're not starting the meeting 10 minutes late or whatever. The board president is really the team captain, and they need to be guiding the meeting along, the lines of the timed agenda. and making sure that the board is staying on topic and not getting, off deviating on topics that don't really pertain to what we're there today to discuss for business. Make sure that board members are prepared. Make sure that they read their packets before they come to the board meeting so that they arrive ready and prepared to discuss association business. And then one really important thing is for the manager or maybe even the president, if you're arranging the agenda, present an issue with a solution or solutions. So one thing that I see, because I attend a lot of board meetings, probably, thousands over the past 25 years, is that sometimes there's a complaint that, hey, boards never get anything done. And so one way for you to be a really efficient and successful board is, so when there's a problem in your association, make sure that whoever is preparing the board for the meeting, which is going to be the time where the board's going to make the decisions, make sure that you give the board options as to how to handle the problem. Because sometimes what I see is, maybe the manager raises a problem and then, they say, oh yeah, that is a problem. And then at the next month's meeting, you're still talking about it. There's no solution. So for example, I have an association that has a problem with a structural problem in their building. And, my recommendation to the board was have a structural engineer come out to see, the issue and review the issue. And so at that next board meeting, the manager should be working with the president, and there should be 3 bids from structural engineers, and provide them with the scope of work that they're going to be doing, so that then the board can make a decision. Okay, we need to make it a vote to determine which structural engineer is the best. And, maybe the board also is going to need to know how much they're going to charge, the scope of the work that they're going to do. The manager should check references prior to that vote by the board, and then put all that information in front of the board for the board to make a decision. So present an issue, but then also have the solution to the issue so that we can move forward and actually accomplish things. We talked a little bit at the beginning of this section on open board meetings about use of virtual board meetings. And, for those of you who have been following our series of classes, like I said, we've had over 40 classes since April of 2020, or March of 2020. Most of our boards, and anytime we do a poll on these classes, we're hearing feedback from residents, board members, and managers that they're really preferring having the meetings virtually. So we want to encourage you to make sure you're checking out our cheat sheet on tips for conducting virtual board meetings. The pandemic has definitely changed how we're all doing business. Having this resource at your fingertips on how you can successfully have a virtual board meeting, I think could be a really useful tip for your board. So we're going to be sharing with you this cheat sheet today. If you're joining us on Zoom or via Facebook Live, you can also find our cheat sheet for tips for conducting virtual board meetings on our website at mulcahylawfirm.com. And that just gives you some really good suggestions on how to have an efficient and hassle-free virtual meeting. And interestingly, some feedback that I've heard from board members is that the virtual board meetings that they're conducting are more efficient than having meetings in person. We get a higher attendance, we're accomplishing more, and there's less agitation and people being upset and angry when this is on a virtual platform. So truly, even after the pandemic ends, this may be something that continues going forward on a regular basis. And I know that I'm going to be meeting with the neighborhood services departments of all the different cities that were putting on these classes for us. And we're going to be talking about, having virtual classes going into 2022, maybe with a sprinkling of some in-person classes too. Okay, last 2 topics we're going to talk about: unanimous consent and email, and in lieu of a regular board meeting. So be really careful on using unanimous written consent. I know that there are some management companies out there that are saying that this is okay. It's our firm's opinion that this is not okay. There have been 2 administrative law decisions by administrative law judges in Arizona that specifically say that use of unanimous by written consent by a board does not comply with the Arizona open meeting law. So we really encourage boards, do not do that going forward. Also, we want to talk a little bit about emergency board meetings again. If a board has an emergency issue where you can't wait 48 hours to notice it, the board can make an email decision via, email. It can be majority rules, as long as there's minutes taken or the emails are kept, and then those emails are read into the record at the very next board meeting. Last but not least, use of email in between meetings just to do general business. Be really careful on that, please. Remember, the intent of the open meeting law is to allow owners an opportunity to be present and listen during a regular board meeting. And if the board is making decisions in between board meetings that are not emergency decisions, you are violating the open meeting law. So what are some things that you can, exchange via email that wouldn't be violations of the open meeting law? You can say, here are 3 bids. We're going to discuss this at the board meeting. Or the manager can give a weekly update as to the type of things that the manager has been working on over the week. And that's fine. You can schedule meetings by email. But when you're actively discussing association issues and with a quorum of the board by using the reply all feature, that is a violation of the open meeting law. Now, what are some loopholes on this where you can, discuss things without violating the open meeting law? If it's less than a quorum, so let's say you have a quorum of 3 if you have a 5-person board. So if you have 2 board members discussing something by email, that's fine. Or if they're discussing it in person and it's less than a quorum, that's fine too. Okay, let's talk very briefly about conflicts during regular board meetings. We all know that there are conflicts that come up from time to time. If you have board member conflicts, make sure that, there's a difference between healthy, discussions and maybe people disagree on things. And there's a difference between that and a board member that is just out of control and is basically making it difficult for your board to even discuss things or to get things done because they're constantly interrupting and making false accusations, etc. If you're a board that's in that situation, you may want to consider having a board boot camp meeting where you bring in a lawyer. Our firm does this often, where we go into the board meeting and we have an actual boot camp and we talk about, what are the issues? Why are people upset? What are the different personality types that are making up the board that might be contributing to this? And how can we all move forward? Because there's a reason we're all on the board, right? We all, want what's best for our community. We may not all agree on the best way to get there, but we all want what's best to make our community, function well and be fiscally sound and look beautiful and keep our property values up. So consider having a boot camp if your board is really dysfunctional and you need to kind of talk through issues so that you can get along better and be more professional in how you're handling things. What do you do if you have a gadfly? Where a gadfly is somebody who in your community comes to your board meetings with the purpose of interrupting your board meetings. So the best ways to deal with the gadfly would be announce at the beginning of the meeting what the meeting procedures are going to be. So you can say, the owners are allowed to participate for 1 minute or 2 minutes during the homeowners forum at the beginning of the meeting. And any other times that they're talking will be considered out of turn unless the board invites participation before the board takes formal action on something. Enforce those procedures uniformly. So if you have somebody who's yelling out or screaming or taking an aggressive physical stance with somebody, give them a warning and then boot them out of the meeting if they are not being, following the rules or being reasonable. No one should be allowed to interrupt board meetings by speaking out of turn or raising irrelevant issues. And so when they do that, use the same strategy. Give them a warning and ask them to leave if they refuse to stop doing that. And remember, if you're a board member, you don't have to rebut the comments of any member or all members. So, if somebody says something that is during the homeowner forum and, they want the boards to comment on something and you don't have that information at your fingertips, it's okay to say, we really don't have that information here tonight. So unfortunately, we won't be able to comment on that. Or just say, thank you for your comments. We appreciate you being here and caring about our association. Whatever you do, don't respond with anger, argue, or trade insults with an owner. It's unprofessional. It makes the board look bad. And it really creates like a level of chaos in your board meetings that you don't want to have. Okay, let's talk about meeting minutes and how to take perfectly proper meeting minutes. On our cheat sheet, which we've shared with you today on Zoom and via Facebook Live, and if you're interested in seeing this information, you can also find it on our website at mulcahylawfirm.com under the board meetings cheat sheet. So remember that the meeting minutes don't reflect every word that was said. Basically, what the meeting minutes do are they reflect the decisions of the board. So if I was going to give you a sample set of meeting minutes that I would, recommend to the board, and I have these actually on the cheat sheet that we provided to you. Basically, the meeting minutes should state what type of meeting is it. Is it a regular meeting of the board? Is it a special meeting of the board? Is it an executive session meeting of the board? Specify the date, the time, and the location. Talk about who attended the meeting. And the most important thing would be the board members so that we know if we had quorum or not. If you had any special guests like the manager, your attorney, or maybe your landscaper or another special guest. You're going to have the approval of the previous meeting minutes. Basically, you don't read those into the record. It's just a vote, and the minutes reflect that the September 2021 board meeting minutes were passed unanimously. On the officer and committee reports, you basically can just do a very short summary of what was described. It may be a sentence. The business of the meeting is going to be kind of the heart of the minutes. And basically, the most important things from the business of the meeting is anything that was decided by the board. So anytime there's going to be a motion, a second, and a vote by the board, that should be included in the minutes. You don't have to put word for word, what the discussion was during the discussion time period on that. The most important thing is what was decided. And then last but not least, when the meeting was adjourned, and then the secretary's signature should be at the bottom of the minutes after the minutes are approved at the next regularly scheduled board meeting. So that's just a quick rundown on the meeting minutes. Remember that they are the official record of the board, and you must take meeting minutes for any regular, special, or executive session meeting of the board. Remember, the meeting minutes should be brief. Really, they should only be about 1 page. And they're not official until they're approved at the next regularly scheduled regular board meeting of your board. You should have a minute book where all the minutes are kept. It may be electronic. It may be an actual notebook or a binder. But those minutes should be kept in with the official records of the association forever. If you have an executive session meeting minutes, those should be kept separate from the regular meeting minutes. And so really that's just a quick summary of everything you need to know about regular board meetings of your board and executive sessions and how to take perfectly proper meeting minutes. So for about the last 10 minutes of this presentation today, we're going to be talking about annual meetings. So annual meetings are different. It's a totally different topic than regular board meetings. So annual meetings are required under Arizona law to be conducted once a year. Now, a question that came up during the pandemic was, let's say you didn't have an annual meeting in 2020 because, we were supposed to have it in April and you didn't because of the pandemic. You weren't able to, transition to do a virtual annual meeting. One thing that I would tell you is move forward. Make sure you're doing annual meetings every year going forward. And most of our clients actually did successfully have virtual annual meetings in 2020, and some have continued to have them in 2021. So in order to have an annual meeting, remember that you have to have a quorum of the members present. And that quorum amount will be listed in your association's bylaws. So you want to make sure that you know what that number is. The minimum number of people that need to be present in order for you to conduct business. Arizona law provides a default quorum of 10% if your bylaws don't give a specific quorum amount, but most of your bylaws, I'd say like 95% of your bylaws will tell you specifically how many people you need to have present to have a quorum. Remember, you have to give notice of your annual meeting to the membership, not less than 10, not more than 50 days in advance of the annual meeting, and that is done by U.S. mail or by hand delivery. Most of our associations are using U.S. mail for their annual meeting notice requirements. The annual meeting, just like a regular board meeting, requires planning in order to have a successful annual meeting. So some thoughts that come to mind about the annual meeting, would be you have to find candidates, right? So every annual meeting, kind of the main purpose of having your annual meeting is to elect directors to run the affairs of your association. So some of you may have a requirement to have a nominating committee in your bylaws. If so, you really do need to follow that. Some of you may not have that, and you may need to, start looking for candidates. And we're going to talk a little bit about what to do if you don't have anybody willing to run for the board in a few minutes. But so the first step to prepare for the annual meeting is to either have a nominating committee or have the board or a committee looking to find candidates to fill any vacancies that are on the board. You have to give notice of the annual meeting, like I said, not less than 10 days before the meeting and not more than 50 days before the annual meeting. That notice typically has the ballots attached to the notice that's mailed to the owners, and the ballots are going to state, approval of last year's annual meeting minutes. It's going to have an opportunity for owners to vote for or against directors. And it may have other information that you may be voting on at the annual meeting. Maybe you're thinking about a special assessment for your association or a capital improvement project, or maybe your association is thinking about taking out a loan. So anytime that there are decisions that need to be made by the owners at an annual meeting, those should be listed on the ballot as well. Okay, so that ballot and the notice of meeting go out in advance of the meeting. Then we get to about a week and a half before the meeting. What are some things that should be on your radar? And I'm sorry I didn't mention this before, but we have a great cheat sheet on conducting an annual meeting. Okay, so you're about a week and a half before game time, right? The annual meeting is the most important meeting of the year for your association. It's the only time that all of your owners typically have, the right to come to their meeting. It's the annual meeting of the association to hear about the state of affairs that are going on in your association, how the finances are, what things you accomplished, what some of your challenges may be. So it's really important to have a quorum, right? Because if you don't have a quorum, you can't have your annual meeting. So about a week and a half before the meeting, you should be doing a check-in on the absentee ballots that have been returned to determine how close are you to having a quorum. If you're not close, you need to pivot and come up with a plan to get more people to return those annual meeting ballots. Some associations have this really cool reminder system where they type in phone numbers and a reminder message is sent. Some associations send out emails to try to increase the chances of getting a quorum. Some associations have a raffle and they offer prizes if you return your annual meeting mail-in or absentee ballot. You qualify to be part of a drawing to, win prizes. And typically those prizes are donated by your vendors. So a week and a half before to a week before the meeting, we really need to be looking at, okay, are we going to have a quorum? And if it doesn't look like it, we need to be pivoting to find ways to get more absentee ballots back so that we do get a quorum. Ideally, the day before the annual meeting, you're going to know you already have a quorum. That's the best case scenario. And then you can walk into the annual meeting with, a sigh of relief, knowing that, okay, we're going to have a quorum. There will be people that show up in person, of course, to help us establish a quorum. But it sure is nice to have that done before the annual meeting by absentee ballots. And really, just because you submitted an absentee ballot doesn't mean you're not going to come to the meeting in person. It just means that you're helping us do the paperwork to get us to a quorum for the annual meeting. Okay, so if you're having an annual meeting in person, you want to make sure that the registration for people is really efficient, and you want to have enough team members for your board or the management company there to quickly check in people so that they're not long lines and the meeting starts late. You're going to want to have an accurate roster of owners. You should have somebody with a laptop with internet who can look up ownership records if anybody shows up and maybe they closed on their property a few days before the annual meeting and they want to vote. We want to be able to look that up on the Maricopa County Recorder or Assessor's Office quickly so that we make sure we give them an opportunity to vote. Some associations have a social event, part of their annual meeting. That's a great way to bond and have some team building in your association. So I would encourage you to do that. Think about having a greeter at the door of the annual meeting to welcome people and show them, you've already returned your mail-in ballot. You can just walk right into the meeting. If you still need to return your absentee or mail-in ballot, here's the line that you go to, etc. Have your governing documents there with you at the annual meeting in case some questions come up and we need to answer them. Make sure you have enough registration materials. Something that people really like to see at an annual meeting would be like last year's meeting minutes for the annual meeting, an agenda, the financial records or a summary, so that they can follow along as the presentation is going. And typically you can just put that right on the registration desk. And then make sure you talk about as a board, are we going to allow nominations from the floor? Of candidates. Make sure you have a game plan on that before you even walk into the annual meeting, because that can be kind of confusing. And really kind of the rule of thumb on nominations from the floor are, look in your bylaws to see if there's any requirement to have nominations from the floor. If there isn't, the board makes a decision whether or not they're going to allow nominations from the floor at the annual meeting. Okay, what are some tips on how the board can shine at the annual meeting? Remember, this is your most highly attended meeting of your community each year. Make sure you're prepared and organized and follow the suggestions that we gave you here tonight or this afternoon or this morning. And it's a good idea to have your association's president speak at the board meeting and have your treasurer at the annual meeting and have your treasurer speak at the annual meeting, giving a state of the financial affairs and the state of the affairs of the association. Make sure you have enough handouts so that people can follow along. Make sure you start the meeting on time. It's always good to feed people. I always find that there's much better behavior if you feed them. So maybe have a party before the meeting starts or after the meeting where residents can socialize and have fun. Make sure you answer questions. This is the time for the homeowners to come and give their opinion on things and ask questions. So be nice, be courteous, thank them for coming, and do your best to try to answer any questions that they may have. Okay, what do you do if you can't get anyone to run for the board, right? We all know serving on the board is rewarding, but at times it can be a thankless and stressful job. So what do you do if your association is at the point where we can't find anybody to run for the board? Well, first, send a letter out from the board asking for volunteers. See if anybody pops up that way. If that doesn't work, call or email committee members or maybe reasonable homeowners who have come to the board on issues before and see if they might be willing to serve on the board. If that doesn't work, something that our firm does is we send a letter out on behalf of the association, just stating what the problems are if we can't find board members to serve on your board for your community. One potential outcome would be that a receiver would be appointed to your association to run the affairs. And let me tell you, that's super expensive. And that will result in a special assessment to pay for the receiver's fees. So usually if we send out a letter, having the attorney for the association send out a letter letting the residents know, hey, if we can't get anybody to volunteer, this is a potential outcome that could happen. I don't think I have ever sent that letter where we didn't get somebody to volunteer after receiving that letter. Then just continue to remind owners that, in order to have a strong and successful community, we need new volunteers with fresh ideas. And it isn't a life sentence to serve on the board. You can just come on for a year or two and then move along. Recognize your board members at the annual meeting because they do volunteer a lot of time. So saying thank you and being nice and appreciative for all the time that they put in is really a great idea. So we've kind of given you the skinny on regular board meetings, everything you needed to know, and how to have a successful annual meeting. Really everything in between. We talked about executive sessions and how to have a quick regular board meeting. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here today for our 10th class of our 2021 virtual HOA and Condo Academy. I'd like to take this time to thank again the different neighborhood service departments from around the Valley who make these classes possible. So thank you for partnering with our firm to the cities of Avondale, Chandler, Glendale, Goodyear, Mesa, Peoria, Phoenix, Scottsdale, Surprise, and Tempe. You've been great teammates, and we appreciate your continued partnership with our firm to provide these free, amazing virtual classes to many residents, in your respective cities. And don't forget, we have classes in November and December via our 2021 virtual HOA and Condo Academy with the Neighborhood Services Departments. So be sure to check out those classes on our website as well at mulcahylawfirm.com. We have 2 classes scheduled for November and 1 class scheduled for our end of the year class in December of 2021. So have a great week, everybody. Thanks for joining us here today. We appreciate you being here, and I look forward to seeing you again virtually for our classes over the last few months of 2021. Take care, be safe, and have a great rest of the week.